recognized for any questions she may have.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I may not actually have a question, but I do have some things I want to say about this because this, you know, we all know that rule writing and the regulations coming out of these agencies is out of control. It's out of control. What do you hear from constituents? They call it, when they call and complain about something happening and you dig into it, it's a rule. It's not something that Congress did, it's a rule. That's what the constituent issues that you need to deal with and try to help them get through this, and you try to figure out how to help them, and it's a rule that has been put in place by unaccountable bureaucrats that have no idea of what's really happening on a farm or in a business in rural Minnesota, but they are able to put these rules in place, carrying the force of law that we haven't, that Congress has had no say in. And I think Mr. Johnson mentioned that there was 3,168 rules, I believe, in 2020, if I'm remembering correctly. I tried to write it down. But I'll tell you, in 2021, Congress passed 143 laws. The federal agencies that year put together 3,257 rules that carry the force of law. That now that someone in rural Minnesota, has to follow, whether or not that bureaucrat, unaccountable bureaucrat, had any idea of what the real impact of it was going to be. We have to be able, when we are creating these things, Congress has to have input. And, Congresswoman Hageman, you said they're political. And I really think that's what we have right now, is they are, because, in particular, because if something doesn't pass in Congress, then they just put it in rule and do it behind everybody's back, and it just becomes a mess, and these people are suffering. And you have a comment you'd like to make?
Well, I think that you've just made it an extremely important point, which is what I was going to make earlier, which is the REINS Act is regulatory neutral. It will apply to both Republicans and Democrats. So it gets at the very political issue that you've said, but there are several other things that I think need to be clarified about this bill, because I don't know if they haven't read it yet or don't understand the significance of what the REINS Act says. But there was a comment made that Congress has been delegating their authority since the beginning of our country, and that's really not true. This delegation concept is largely of a modern origin. We didn't really have the regulatory state prior to the New Deal, in fact, so there weren't the agencies to delegate to. So that's one of the things that I think is very important, is this has only been in the last 80 to 90 years that we've seen it, and I would argue, again, as a practitioner, that the last 30 years, there has been an enormous explosion in the number of rules. Another point that I think is very important is that when the folks on the other side talk about the REINS Act, they act as though Congress would be reviewing every single regulation that is adopted, and that isn't the case. These are major regulations. Again, I'd like the number to be lower, but they are at $100 million. Going back to the information, in 2021, the Biden administration issued 3,257 rules. But 387, or 12%, were deemed significant. So the REINS Act doesn't address 88% of the regulations that came out of the Biden administration in 2021 alone. I don't anticipate those numbers to change dramatically. Again, I think 100 million is too high of a number, but setting that aside, I think another important point to make, and this again is from someone who's actually been out in the field and seen how these regulations are enforced, the larger the rule, the more damage they can cause, the more unintended consequences we suffer from. And I'm going to give you an example of this. In 2001, under the Clinton administration, one of the very last things that they did on the way out the door was adopt the roadless rule. The roadless rule denied access, management, and use to 58.5 million acres of National Forest Service lands. That was a regulation. That was not legislation coming out of this body. That was a regulation that denied access, management, and use to 1/3 of our national forests. We have 192 million acres in our National Forest Service. And that was almost 1/3. And what have we seen in the last 20 years? And it's not because of climate change or global warming. It is because of a failure of our Forest Service to be able to manage our resources. We've seen a huge increase in catastrophic forest fires. We've seen a devastation of our national forests because of the pine beetle outbreak, which they knew about at the time that they adopted the roadless rule. The larger the rule, the more damage it can cause. That is another reason, not just from an economic standpoint, that we ought to be looking at rules of $100 million, but why in the world would we want an agency to be able to adopt a regulation that has that kind of an economic impact on this country and have no legislative oversight at all?
Thank you very much. And I will just say one more thing. The unaccountability. There's just no accountability on these rules. And you're so right. I mean, they are so damaging. And the folks that are writing these either don't care or don't understand or just want to produce rules because they are not doing any good in all of the, in particular, in a rural area. And they're regulating farms, they're regulating all kinds of things that they have no business regulating.
Thank you.
But with that, I yield back. Oh, you're the chair. Look at you. There.
Thank you. I appreciate it. It's my understanding that the gentlelady from New Mexico and the gentleman from Kentucky